All right, if you've got your Bible, if you'll make your way over to Revelation chapter 18, Revelation chapter 18 for today's study. And so, if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, chapter 17 was really a description of this kingdom of the Antichrist. It's referred to as Babylon the Great, and probably the reason for that is, if you remember, that term Babylon is really indicative of an anti-God mindset throughout the Old Testament, back from the time of the Tower of Babel through the time of the Babylonian Empire. And so that's probably why it's referenced in that way. But if you remember, the kingdom was presented as that of a prostitute, and so the idea was that this kingdom was very attractive, very appealing to the world. It was very wealthy, very prosperous, filled with idolatry. The analogy is that of sexual immorality, but it references that implies spiritual adultery in the sense of idolatry. And so the whole kingdom was centered around idolatry, the worship of the beast and the image of the beast. It's incredibly immoral, probably the most wicked, immoral kingdom that the world will have ever seen. It's just anything goes, and so immorality will be rampant. We also saw that the kingdom will hate the people of God, and the people of God will be persecuted. They will be killed at the hands of this empire. But ultimately, though, despite all those things, ultimately this kingdom, it will not prevail, and it won't prevail for a couple of reasons. One, we saw there in chapter 17, there comes a time when the great city, which is probably a reference to Jerusalem, maybe the capital city of this kingdom, it begins to turn on itself, and those who are in charge really contribute to its downfall, as they no longer have any use for the people. They kind of cast them aside and begin to just kind of tear things apart. But the main reason that this kingdom will not prevail is because we have this final surge of God's wrath that is poured out on this kingdom just prior to the return of Christ and what is known as the Battle of Armageddon. And so let me reference really what's happening here back in chapter 16. If you'll glance chapter 16, the chapter that had the bowl judgments, I want to read the last paragraph there, beginning with verse 17. It says, Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, It is done. There were flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake occurred like no other since people have been on the earth. So great was the quake. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered in God's presence. He gave her the cup filled with the wine of his fierce anger. Every island fled, and the mountains disappeared. Enormous hailstones, each weighing about 100 pounds, fell from the sky on people, and they blasphemed God for the plague of hail, because that plague was extremely severe. And so what we see there in that seventh bowl judgment is really this final surge of God's wrath before the return of Christ, and it's the destruction of this kingdom of the Antichrist, Babylon the Great. And so now in chapter 18, we're given a few more details about that, details highlighting this outpouring of God's wrath and the destruction of this kingdom. And so if you've got your handout, you'll see we've got the outline here, kind of dividing the text into 3 parts. And so the first thing we noticed is that Babylon is destroyed. Babylon is destroyed, and this works itself out kind of in 4 different parts of the text. So we're going to skip around a little bit in the chapter, but the first thing we see is the announcement of destruction. The announcement of destruction, beginning with verse 1, John says, After this I saw another angel with great authority coming down from heaven, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. He called out in a mighty voice, It has fallen. Babylon the Great has fallen. She has become a home for demons, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean spirit, and then every unclean bird, and a haunt for every unclean and despicable beast. And so this great angel comes and announces the end result of this kingdom. And so the description here gives the sense that it will end up being nothing but this abandoned, desolate wasteland. And that's what's meant by mentioning the demons and unclean spirits. There was a thought in that day that demons inhabited the desert and barren places, and so it says that's what this city will become. You have the presence of these scavenger birds there. It's just completely barren and desolate. If you'll look at the end of the chapter, beginning on verse 21, it says, "Then a mighty angel picked up a stone like a large millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, In this way Babylon, the great city, will be thrown down violently and never be found again. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No craftsman of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a mill will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again, and the voice of a groom and bride will never be heard in you again." And so it's noted here that the destruction again is going to be total. It says this large millstone thrown into the sea, and it says that Babylon's going to be like that. And so this large stone thrown into the sea, what's going to happen? It's going to sink. And so it says that's what's going to happen with the city. It's never going to be seen again. And it goes through here. There'll no longer be there'll be no music. There'll be no business, no light, no joyful occasions like weddings. It's all gone. Every bit of it destroyed. And so that which was so appealing and so attractive and so prosperous by the world's standards will come to complete ruin. And so you have the announcement of destruction. The next thing you see is there are reasons for destruction. Some reasons are given. And so if you go back, verse 3 says, "For all the nations have drunk the wine of her sexual immorality, which brings wrath. The kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown wealthy from her sensuality and excess." And so we see here a couple of reasons. One, the reference to sexual immorality again is most likely referring to idolatry. That again, this kingdom is built on idolatry, the worship of the beast and his image. And so the kings and the nations have committed this great idolatry. You also see here, I think, a reference to the sin of greed and really kind of exploiting others financially, with the mention there at the end of verse 3 of the merchants of the earth growing wealthy. And so we know that there are some harsh words throughout Scripture for those who would take advantage of others in this type of way. And so we see that sin mentioned. Look at verse 7. It says, "As much as she glorified herself and indulged her sensual and excessive ways, give her that much torment and grief. For she says in her heart, I sit as a queen. I'm not a widow, and I will never see grief." And so what's highlighted here is really the sin of pride. It says this, again, the analogy here is this woman who is a prostitute, but yet she views herself as a queen. Here I am, I'm a queen, and I'll never be like widows. I'll never grieve. Nothing will ever be taken from me. I'm on top of the world. I have it all. And it says that's the way probably the Antichrist and the leaders in this kingdom, they feel. They feel as if nothing can ever be taken from them, that they do indeed have it all. And so you see the sin of great pride. Again, go to the end of the chapter, picking up where we left off in verse 23. We read half of that verse earlier. Go back to the last half of that verse. It says, "All this will happen because your merchants were the nobility of the earth," probably another reference to greed there, but also because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. And so there's this wickedness and sorcery and deception. They've led the people of the world astray to give in to all of these evil and sinful desires. And then verse 24, "In her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all those slaughtered on the earth." And so there was the killing of God's people as well. And so you see these reasons for the destruction of the city. It was just a completely wicked and rebellious city and kingdom of idolatry and pride and greed and all of these things. So you have the announcement of destruction, the reasons for destruction, and then the chapter also highlights the means of destruction. The means of destruction. It's clear that this destruction comes from God. Look at verse 5. "For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes." Sometimes it's easy for us to look around and we see great evil in the world. We see terrible acts of injustice in the world, and we think, Does God even notice these things? Why isn't God doing anything about this? Well, he does notice. And it says here that he remembers, and it's as if he's keeping a ledger of these things. And one day, it will be time, his time for him to act in judgment against these things. He does see these things. He remembers these things. Look at verse 8, the last part of verse 8. It says, she'll be burned up with fire because the Lord God who judges her is mighty. And so God is the one who brings judgment. And so we remember that God will not be mocked. God will not be mocked. Vengeance is mine, declares the Lord. And so we see this playing out here. We also, thinking about the means of destruction, look at verse 6. It says, pay her back the way she also paid, and double it according to her works. And the cup in which she mix a double portion for her. And so it said that she will be paid back double in the way that she mistreated others. And so it's all going to come back on this kingdom. As much as this kingdom has exploited and mistreated others, it's going to come back upon them. It says double in the form of God's judgment, which you see in verse 8 mentions death and grief and famine and fire. And so the means of destruction is highlighted here. The last thing we want to note here concerning the destruction of Babylon is found in verse 4, that God's people are spared destruction. God's people are spared destruction. Verse 4 says, then I heard another voice from heaven, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins or receive any of her plagues. Notice it says this is another voice. The first voice was that of this mighty angel. I think here this is probably the voice of God. It says another voice, and it references my people, so I think this is the voice of God. What do we make of this verse? Well, there's a couple of ways that it could be viewed. The main way to view this verse, this is the kind of the majority view, is that this is just a call or a warning for God's people to run away from the sin and immorality that's present in that day, because judgment is coming. And it's so easy to lose our way. It's so easy to get distracted. So stay alert and to flee from sin, to flee from immorality. But another possible thing that this could be referring to is this could be a reference to the rapture. For those like me that are from a post-trib perspective, all of this is right before the return of Christ. And so it could be that in this moment, this is the moment when God says, when he says, come out of her, my people, that he is rapturing the saints into his presence here with the return of Christ. Again, I'm not saying that is what's happening. I'm saying it's a possibility there. That could be what the text is referring to. The important lesson from these verses here concerning the destruction of Babylon is that God's judgment upon the wickedness of this world is coming. God will have his vengeance. That's something that we can be certain of, no matter how powerful any government or any system of this world becomes, no matter how powerful and wealthy and influential, nothing will ever be a match against God. No kingdom will ever prevail against God. And so all that is wicked and evil will one day come to an end. So first we note here that Babylon is destroyed. The second part of the text that we want to look at is that the world mourns. So Babylon is destroyed, and then the world mourns. We see three groups that are highlighted in the text that mourn the fall of Babylon. Let's work through the text here. Verse 9 and 10 mentions the kings of the earth. It says, the kings of the earth who have committed sexual immorality and shared her sensual and excessive ways will weep and mourn over her when they see the smoke from her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city, Babylon, the mighty city, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And so these kings, if you remember, it really is at this time a one world government. The Antichrist is really ruling over the entire world, but he has various kings that are ruling in different places, and that's who's referred to here. But so that they are guilty of idolatry and this lust for power. And it says they weep and mourn as the city falls, even though in one sense they contributed to the downfall. We saw in chapter 17 it reached a point where they began to hate the prostitute, it says, and so they kind of contributed to things, but everything that they had put their hopes and dreams in, everything that they loved was now crashing down, and so they weep and mourn. But notice that they're far away. They're far away, just seeing from a distance, because perhaps they're trying to avoid the same fate. The next group it mentions, beginning with verse 11, is the merchants of the earth. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, because no one buys their cargo any longer. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of fragrant wood products, objects of ivory, objects of expensive wood, brass, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, and frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour, and grain, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages and slaves, human lives. The fruit you craved has left you. All your splendid and glamorous things are gone. They will never find them again. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, jewels, and pearls, for in a single hour such fabulous wealth was destroyed. So these merchants were guilty of this greed and exploitation. You see all kinds of expensive things mentioned here, which shows that even though in these last days it'll be a time of great sorrow and trial and horrible things happening on the earth, there are many who are going to prosper during that time and become very wealthy. And so these merchants were some of those, and they were guilty. It also mentioned human trafficking, all of these things, but they profited from this kingdom, this city. And so they weep and mourn as they lose their great wealth. But again, they are far away, also trying to avoid the same fate. And then similar to these merchants, it mentions also the sea traders. If you'll pick back up in the text there, the middle of verse 17. And every shipmaster, seafarer, the sailors, and all who do business by sea stood far off, as they watched the smoke from her burning, and kept crying out, Who was like the great city? They threw dust on their heads and kept crying out, weeping and mourning, Woe, woe, the great city, where all those who have ships on the sea became rich from her wealth, for in a single hour she was destroyed. And so again, those who profited from the city's prosperity and immorality weep and mourn, again far away, hoping to avoid the same fate. Let me just highlight a couple of things to note from this section. First, did you pick up on the repetition of destroyed in a single hour? All three groups noted that. This great city, wow, it was destroyed in a single hour. And I don't know that that's to be taken literally, like the city was completely destroyed and fell in an hour. Maybe it is. It could be just a reference to just that it happens quickly, that they're amazed that this incredible empire, so powerful, so strong, so wealthy, that it fell so quickly. And so it's a reminder that when God's judgment arrives, when that time comes, His judgment is swift and severe. It's very easy for us to sometimes believe that it's okay to run from God. It's okay to just do what I want to do. I've got plenty of time. I've got plenty of time to change things. I've got plenty of time to get right with God. But we never know when God is going to say, enough. Enough. And when that happens, it's too late. And so it's a good reminder of that from the text. But also I think we see here that there's mourning and weeping and the repetition of woe. The reaction in these verses is really the same for anyone who places their hope in the things of this world. It doesn't last. It all comes crashing down. The pleasure of sin is temporary. The security of wealth is temporary. And so if you look outside of Jesus for meaning and hope and purpose, this is the end result. The world will not satisfy. And again, all three groups, it says that they are watching from far off what is happening. And again, I think they're trying to avoid the same judgment, but they can't. This outcome is inevitable for all of those who reject Jesus. And so Babylon is destroyed. The world mourns. And then the last part of the text, that we've just got one verse left that we haven't looked at. Verse 20, we see this. God's people rejoice. God's people rejoice. Look at verse 20. Rejoice over her, heaven, and you saints, apostles, and prophets, because God has pronounced on her the judgment that she passed on you. Notice the great contrast here between verses 9 through 19 and then verse 20. The central theme of 9 through 19 is this weeping and mourning and woe. But in verse 20, there is great rejoicing. All of heaven, all of God's people are called to rejoice over the judgment that's being handed out to this kingdom of Babylon. One thing that we probably think about when we read this verse is, what do we make of this? In one sense, shouldn't God's people pray for people like this instead of rejoicing in their destruction? And sometimes it's hard to think through that. That's a good question. That's a good thought that many of you may be kind of working through is how can God's people rejoice in destruction like this, the destruction of others? And here's the best answer that I have for that. I think at this point, when this time arrives, it's going to be abundantly clear. It will be abundantly clear that these are the people who have fully rejected the Lord Jesus. There's no hope for their redemption. We saw that earlier. Those who took the mark of the beast and worshipped him, that their fate was sealed. And so there's no hope for the redemption of these people. And they can rightly be classified as the enemies of God. And so I think that has to be considered. But I also think that in that day, because of all the things that will be happening, in all of we see great evil and wickedness in the world now, but it's only going to intensify. And the amount of wickedness and evil that's present, and the amount of harm that's being done to God's people, and all the things that'll be happening, I think in that day that God's people will have a better understanding of God's judgment, and that his judgment is always holy and righteous and pure. And so these are people that have repeatedly blasphemed the Lord. They have rejected Jesus again and again and again. They have committed great idolatry and wickedness. They have killed the people of God. And so now, in this moment, God's people celebrate as God responds and has his vengeance. And so, again, we do live in a dark world. There's so much evil. There's so much injustice. But we hold out hope that one day all will be made right. That we will celebrate. A day is coming when we will celebrate the triumph of all that is good. Of all that is good and holy and righteous over that which is evil and wicked. Let me just give you one kind of final thought. There's a lot to kind of think through in this chapter, but I think if I could give you one final thing to note, it would be referencing verse 4 again. And so again, I said that there's a chance that could refer to the rapture, but I think the main way to probably look at this verse, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins or receive any of her plagues, is just a warning to God's people. Be alert, stay vigilant, to avoid the pitfalls of this world. We have to flee from that which is evil. It's so easy to get distracted. It's easy to be attracted to sin, and we have to flee. We have to run away from that which is sinful and immoral, and we have to pursue Christ. We have to run to Christ. And the reality is that there is no standing still when it comes to our spiritual lives. You're never stuck in neutral. You're either drifting away from Christ or you're either being drawn near to Him. And so may we be faithful to avoid the traps of this world and that which is sinful, and to continue to follow after Christ and to pursue Him daily. And so let's not get distracted. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus. Remain faithful to the end. And I promise you it will be worth it. It will be worth it. Rejoicing and celebration are just around the corner.